Welcome, everyone, to the Unification Theological Seminary Virtual Faculty Roundtable. In this setting, faculty members of UTS are invited to speak about an academic topic or an area of research of interest to the greater UTS community. We're very happy to have with us today members of our faculty, our staff, our students and alumni. Actually, we have folks gathered from around the United States and actually from around the world. So welcome to all of you. In this age where we're becoming more and more expert in the area of distance communications, the Faculty Roundtable has truly become an international event. So we welcome you all. This is a housekeeping reminder. Please be sure to keep your microphones on mute for the duration of the program so as not to interrupt the sound of the speaker in the presentation. Questions during this presentation will be received in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and you're welcome to enter your questions at any time during the program. They'll be gathered, and at the appropriate time in our Q&A session, they'll be directed to our speaker. So before we proceed any further, I just want to say that during the program, I'm going to be sharing with everyone my contact information as Dean of Enrollment Management and responsible for the admissions activities here at UTS, as well as some links of interest about UTS's programs and how to apply. If you're interested in learning more about studying at UTS, be sure to reach out to me. Or if you know of someone that you think would benefit from UTS studies, please feel free to share my information with them. So to begin our program, I'm very happy to invite up to introduce our program and to act as our host today, our president, Dr. Thomas Walsh. Dr. Walsh is the 7th president of Unification Theological Seminary, and he is a 1979 graduate of the Unification Theological Seminary. Dr. Walsh later went on to earn his PhD at Vanderbilt University School of Religion, where he specialized in the study of religion and ethics. Since his graduation, Dr. Walsh has taught courses at a number of colleges and universities, as well as at UTS. As he became more involved with the academic and ecumenical activities of the Unification Movement in the 1990s, he continued to teach part-time for a number of years. As all of us know, Dr. Walsh has worked closely with the co-founders of UTS for many years, Dr. Sun Myung Moon and Dr. Hak Jahan Moon. And in addition, Dr. Walsh has edited more than 20 books and publications and serves as the executive editor for Dialogue and Alliance, which is an academic journal indexed by the American Theological Library Association. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Walsh. Dr. Walsh?
Thank you, Dean Boyd. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for that kind and generous introduction. I'm happy to moderate this faculty roundtable. Since coming to UTS, I've really enjoyed these opportunities to hear from our faculty members. Recently, we had a very wonderful faculty roundtable featuring Dr. Noda talking about philosophical issues, looking specifically at phenomenology and the phenomenology of religion. And Dr. Andrew Wilson had a fascinating program featuring his research in the area of early Christianity and Judaism in the years after Jesus' crucifixion and relevance to our own time. And tonight we're in for a real treat to hear from our distinguished professor of historical studies here at UTS, Dr. Michael Mickler, whose fuller bio is in the chat column. I also want to commend our provost, Dr. Thomas Ward, on many things, but particularly, I think he was the driving force behind a recent research day where faculty and students brought forward their research and summarized their research and gave video presentations. And in fact, there was a panel of judges. I was happy to serve as one and review all of the contributions from our students and faculty alike, Dr. Mickler and Dr. Kone and Dr. Ward, and also from Colby College, distinguished professor of the history of science, Dr. James Fleming, another alum. So a lot of great areas of research that are exciting to see, in addition to our publication, the Journal of Unification Studies. And so we really are seeking to become this kind of center or home of thought and ideas that can contribute to building a better world and to significant cutting edge research. So tonight we're very happy to hear more about the research of Dr. Mickler. He's well known within our, and I'll use the term church movement, for his historical work on family federation, the kind of beginnings of our church movement in America, and has expanded on that research over the years. And most recently, this volume with Cambridge University Press that I'm sure he's proud of, but also we're all proud of as a member of a senior faculty member here at UTS. So I'm sure this is available on Amazon.com. So I hope after tonight's program, you'll be eager to take a look at this. Dr. Mickler did his graduate studies at Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, and has been really a dedicated, committed historian over these many decades, and has benefited greatly our own church and Unification Theological Seminary. So I know we're eager to hear from him. Our topic is the title of his book. It starts out, The Unification Church Movement, published by Cambridge University Press, and he has the subtitle, Shaping the Public Narrative. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to invite Dr. Michael Mickler to begin his presentation. Dr. Mickler.
Thank you, Dr. Walsh. It's an honor to be here this evening. I do have a PowerPoint that I'm going to share. Hope it comes up. Okay, good. So as Dr. Walsh.
Dr. Mickler, we're seeing your presenter mode. Can you switch to the full screen mode?
Oh, okay. Let's see, share screen. It's not, you're not seeing full screen?
No, what we're seeing is a presenter's mode.
Okay.
If you do you have two screens?
I do.
Okay, if you want to share the other screen, that should have the full picture, not this screen, show your other screen.
Let's see. I'll tell you what. What are you seeing at this point?
Nothing, you're not sharing now.
All right, I'm very sorry. Just a moment. Okay.
That looks good. Yeah.
Now?
Yeah, great. Looks great. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. So I wanted to start by saying something about my subtitle. It's the Unification Church Movement, Shaping the Public Narrative. So by narrative, we simply mean basically story. The stories we tell about ourselves, the stories others tell about us, go a long way to shaping our identities. And I think that's true at all levels. The stories we tell about ourselves and others tell about us as individuals, as families, societies, nations, and even the world. And those narratives not only inform our identity, but they also inform our decision making. where we will invest our energy and where we will align ourselves. So thinking about the subtitle that I have this evening, Shaping the Public Narrative, or the Unification Church Movement, Shaping the Public Narrative, I realize there's kind of a double meaning here. It could refer to the ways that the Unification Church Movement has shaped public thought, discourse, and policy on a variety of issues. And that's very important. In fact, that may be the most important consideration that we want to think about in relation to the Unification Church Movement. However, it also could refer to shaping public thought, discourse, and policy about the Unification Church Movement. And that's the topic that I'm going to present on. How do we shape the public narrative about the Unification Church Movement? And that's also very important because it impacts the Unification Church Movement's ability to exert public influence. So that's the subject matter of what I'm going to present on. And I thought I had a image of my text, but my remarks will be based on the book I recently published with Cambridge University Press, which is actually the oldest university press in the world and one of the most eminent. So it's a good place to start in shaping a narrative. So the book is part of a series of short volumes, about 30,000 words or 75 pages, published by CUP, Cambridge University Press, on new religious movements. And they're intended to be original, succinct, authoritative, peer-reviewed, scholarly, and scientific research for graduate students, researchers, and practitioners. To go beyond stereotypes and prejudices to present NRMs, new religious movements, and their adherents in a scholarly and engaging manner. There are two types of volumes that they publish in this series. One are case studies of individual groups for in-depth consideration. And the second are thematic examinations of specific issues unique to new religious movements, such as women, children, science, technology, etc. These are a sample of some of the volumes in the series to this point. There's a volume on brainwashing, reality or myth by Massimo Introvigne, who many of you may recognize as one of our great defenders in the situation in Japan recently. Scientology, People's Temple, Transcendental Meditation, etc. So these are some select volumes in this particular series. So as I was saying, both popular and scholarly accounts play roles in shaping the public narrative around new religious movements. And the UCM, Unification Church Movement, has been one of the most controversial NRMs throughout the world, especially in Japan and the West. Therefore, the public narrative around the Unification Church Movement has been and continues to be a battleground, with proponents of conflicting narratives holding their positions with passionate intensity. And this battle over the UCM narrative holds forth both on external and internal fronts. The external battleground has to do with the UCM's legitimacy and even its legality as a new religious movement. So in Korea in the 50s, the Unification Church Movement was depicted as a heretical sect, a pseudo-religious sex cult in which members danced in the nude. The church was underground. It didn't attain legal standing until the next decade. In Japan, in 1967, the UCM came to attention as the religion that makes parents weep. Later, it was when the Marxists attacked the church, it was regarded as a fascist tool of the KCIA. Later in the 80s, a business masquerading as a religion, and currently there's an effort to dissolve the UCM as a legal entity in Japan. These depictions carried over to the West, where members were denigrated as Moonies, alleged to be brainwashed, forcefully extracted, Father and Mother Moon were banned from European countries, for example, for more than a decade. So the UCM has spent a great deal of time and resources combating these claims and has had successes, but has not been fully able to reverse them. So that's the external battleground. The internal battleground has to do with rival leadership claims. So this was really not an issue for most of the UCM's history. And during Father Moon's lifetime, there were some minor schismatic groups, some of which depicted him as a forerunner to their leader. But after his death, two of his sons introduced a new dynamic, claiming to be his rightful successor. Both of them definitively broke from family federation, sought to discredit and displace their mother as leader of the unification community, and opposed one another. They worked to siphon off members and resources and influence some, including some important scholars of NRMs, to conclude that the post-Sun Myung Moon unification movement had broken into three relatively equal factions. And they have been aggressive at NRM international colloquia and such, looking to persuade the scholars in this direction. We've only recently started contending against that depiction or that narrative. So the purpose of my research, as stated in the book, is to provide a historical account of Unification Church Movement origins and development, bring to bear sources not previously used or accessible to scholars, some of which are not published and the bulk of which are UCM materials, and to be as comprehensive as possible in highlighting the leading personalities, organizations, and circumstances that facilitated the UCM's rise, present challenges, and future development. I do have a couple of unstated purposes that I don't put in the book. One of them is to help create an environment for witnessing. I don't say that explicitly. I can't really say that in a book published by Cambridge University Press. I can be descriptive, but I can't really proclaim in this kind of work. So that's one of my purposes. A second would be to counter the three-faction narrative with the narrative that the UCM consists of a mainstream body with several splinter groups and schismatic organizations. So I just like to consider for a moment what we might call a toolbox for constructing viable narratives, and particularly viable narratives within a scholarly setting. And so I have a few instruments in my toolbox that I would just mention, some necessary components. For example, you do need to cultivate appropriate detachment. You need to have the capacity to put aside your subjectivity, at least to the extent of not being personally hurt or devastated or angry by criticism. You need to have command of sources. You need to have a breadth and depth of awareness of the subject matter with which you are working. You need to have honesty. You need to have the willingness to acknowledge blemishes, complexity, and nuance, that there may be competing trends or tendencies within ongoing development. You need to have an ability to contextualize, to step back from the immediate and see the larger context, see connections, see causal relations, etc. And you do need a degree of courage, a willingness to put your name on a manuscript that goes out into the public. So the book is divided into 6 sections. There's an introduction. There's a section called Beginnings, which is really the UCM's prehistory. And then a chapter on the Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity, HSA UWC 1954 to 1994, a section on the Family Federation for World Peace and Unification, 1994 to the present, a section on schismatic organizations, and conclusions. So I'm going to run through these sections with you, highlighting some key points. So from the introduction, Um, I do a number of things that are typical to introductions. For example, I define the Unification Church Movement. And the way I define the Unification Church Movement is stated there: an international constellation of churches, related nonprofit organizations, and for-profit businesses that derive from the messianic ministry of Father Moon. And so it's kind of a broad and inclusive definition, and therefore I do include schismatic groups, which by their own self-definition derive from the messianic ministry of Father Moon. I talk about the founding vision of United Christian Denominations, bringing unity among the world's religions and ushering in the kingdom of heaven on earth. Foundational understandings, Father and Mother Moon as the embodiments of unification faith and the blessing through which men and women reconstitute themselves as a new humanity. A brief summary of beliefs as expressed in both formal doctrinal texts and in the UCM's oral tradition. I do briefly discuss the organizational identity as a church and a movement. Maybe we can have further discussion about that. The leadership profile, I bring in the concept of charismatic leadership. I argue that Father Moon fit the classic definition of the charismatic leader as one endowed with supernatural, superhuman, or at least exceptional powers and qualities. I highlight some of the controversies that's often a byproduct of charismatic leadership, as charismatic leadership tends to be disruptive, undercutting the status quo. I mentioned the scope of the research. It's not a sociological or theological analysis, but an historical account of the origins and development. That's what the press wanted. They wanted a historical account. I overview the book sections, and I summarize the conclusions and challenges. So I'm going to, the next section is called Beginnings, which is really the prehistory. And I have several actually only two subsections. I have Father Moon's background and early life, which includes the Korean religious context, his family background, formative influences, his life-altering Easter encounter with Jesus Christ, and his decade-long preparation for mission and ministry. And the second subsection is the early ministry, which I follow in Seoul, to Pyongyang, to Hongnam, and Busan. I do have a brief section talking about the sources. Obviously, True Father's autobiography as a peace-loving global citizen. Another source that is quite important that many of you may know of or not know of is a work called True Parents Life Course in 12 volumes. It's a Korean publication, partially translated into English. There were 42 installments of this book published in Today's World over 5 years, from 2007 to 2012. And if you read them, you see there that these are largely source material for the autobiography, but then they add a lot more material. Another source for this period is Michael Breen's Samyamun, The Early Years. His contribution are all the interviews he did with early relatives and associates. There are some testimonies and a few scholarly studies that are brought in. So I can't go through each of these sections. I just want to highlight a couple of the subsections. I want to say something about the Korean religious context out of which the UCM emerged. One recent study claims that some 500 new religions have established themselves in Korea since the end of the 19th century. So a great proliferation of new religions. And these are quite diverse. They derive from, Buddhist, Confucian, and Christian sources, but they do exhibit common traits. Among these are a strong spirit of nationalism, expectation of a messianic figure to redeem people from suffering, plans for a physical utopia and transformation of the present world into an ideal one, teachings divinely revealed to a founder, and efforts to integrate traditional patterns with foreign influences. So these are common traits among Korean new religions, and the UCM shares these features, but it's unique among Korean new religions in at least one way. It's the only one that has achieved global prominence. It's the only one that has really transcended the Korean cultural and religious context and made its way onto the global scene. And I argue that this development is rooted in the biography of the founder. So that's a segue into speaking about Father Moon's upbringing, his background, and so forth, which I can't go into. I don't have the time, but I do want to say something about his early ministry, that is from 45 to 53. There is an interesting progression. His public ministry starts in Seoul in 45 and 46. And what he attempts to do at that point is to connect to Christianity's existing foundation. So he tries to connect to, evangelical Christians, liberal ones, and spiritual groups. He's not really successful at that. And he ends up going up to Pyongyang. Actually, this is something, I'm going to go into this in more detail a little bit later when I talk about HSA after our break pause. But he goes to Pyongyang, and at this point, he is actively seeking followers. So in the earlier ministry in Seoul, he wasn't necessarily looking for followers. He was looking to connect to Christianity's existing foundation. Going to Pyongyang in the north, he actively sought followers and led an independent congregation. Of course, the communist government cracked down on him. He ended up in Hyungnam prison camp, and eventually makes his way to Busan, where he restarts with a refugee congregation. So my conclusion is Father Moon had marginal success in gaining a following. It's kind of one step forward, two steps back, but he succeeded in consolidating his teachings and setting the foundations of what would become the Unification Church. And I'm going to go into this topic of the Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity. Dr. Walsh, do we want to pause here? Should I keep going, or is this a good place to pause?
Why don't we take just a couple of minutes, and then we certainly want to hear the rest of your presentation, but maybe you and I have a little bit of dialogue before you continue. First of all, thank you. Excellent, well-organized presentation as always, and full of meaningful content. Going to focus a little bit on your title. I'm sure you gave some thought to calling it Unification Church Movement, because over the years, we've sometimes referred to ourselves as a movement and at other times a church. And I think it's judicious that you kind of combine them. Maybe if you want to elaborate on that a little bit and the implications of one over the other. Maybe I'll let you say whatever you want about that. And then I'm going to ask you a little bit about this concept of narrative and the subtitle.
Yeah, I did an article back in 2006 or 7 in a 4-volume work on new religions, and they insisted that I have the title Unification Church Movement. They wanted both of those in the title. I think it kind of describes our evolution as a religion. Holy Spirit Association began as a association, right? And it very quickly took on the contours of a church with all the elements that one would see in a church. But then at a certain point, it began developing as a social movement and began developing cultural initiatives public advocacy work and businesses and the like. And so HSA continued, but this constellation of organizations surrounding the unification, what became known as Tongil Kyohei, the Unification Church, also took on the character of a movement. And so I think the Unification Movement has been creative in developing these two elements where you have a committed core and you have surrounding that core groups and individuals that resonate with the vision and mission and can be in a supportive capacity. So also Unification Church probably has more name recognition. If you title, I mean, you could say the Unification Movement, and that would take into account the church aspect, the nonprofits, and the businesses. But Unification Movement has less name recognition than Unification Church does, which has broad recognition. So having that in the title is helpful for directing the reader to what you're talking about.
Yeah, I like it. Because I think one without the other is kind of limiting and getting the point across. Just a little bit. I'm very happy you gave a little further elaboration on this concept of narrative. It's certainly a widely used word. There's been in some ways a kind of a shift in recent decades. I know even when I studied ethics years ago, there was a shift toward narrative ethics that rather than rational philosophical approaches to ethics, that ethics could be taught through telling stories, stories of great men and women and their lives and the character that they embodied through the narrative of a human life, that our lives are stories. So I think it is a great concept. And then you distinguish between how this idea of public narrative could be construed on the one hand as we're trying to shape the wider society and let's say it's public narrative versus trying to help. And I think you land in this area of helping the wider society have a better understanding of our story, our narrative, and you could roughly call them, the cult brainwashing, the movement that makes parents cry narrative, and the more respectful new religious movement narrative of I'm proud of my children and they're trying to make a better world, and look at how they're similar to early Christianity, who also was despised and persecuted, slandered, etc. So I think this task of which you relate even to this concept that we've sometimes used, how do we impact the wider social cultural environment to be more appreciative of our movement? So I thank you for that. If you want to just build on anything I just said on that, I think that would be welcome as well, because I think this concept is important and wisely selected by you.
The religion that makes parents weep quote was in one of the major newspaper in Japan in '67, and the reason it made parents weep is because unlike other religions, the unification adherents moved out of their parents' home and into centers, which was unusual in Japan, and that's why the parents wept and took action later. Jesus, of course, used narrative in his ethic and in his instruction, and so yeah, I mean, I'd have to put on my epistemological hat with Dr. Noda to understand the different ways of knowing truth. I think there's a scientific way of knowing truth. I think there's a scientific rational. I think there's I used to know these, but I think there's intuitive ways of knowing truth. I think there's revelatory ways of knowing truth. So there are sacred narratives. I mean, the scripture tends to be a sacred narrative in which we locate ourselves in that narrative. And then, of course, there are all manner of narratives that are competing in our society.
Yeah, and as you said, Jesus spoke in the Gospels are stories, and kind of rational systematic theology kind of builds out of narrative in that sense. So it is kind of fundamental to who we are as people who live through history. Do you want to say anything about, you said you were asked by the editors to give a historical account. Now, you are a historian, you are a distinguished professor of historical studies, but you kind of no doubt work within the spheres of sociology and theology. This will be my last intervention, and just if you want to just talk something about how those might interplay together.
Yeah, well, I think that historical narratives take into account causal elements that are social in nature. Hence, you take into account sociological forces, and definitely intellectual currents shape history, including theological ideas. What drives history? Is it ideas? Is it social forces? Is it leaders, great people? These are things that historians debate in terms of causation. And I'd like to work with all of the above.
Yeah.
But my primary medium would be historical, rather than stepping back into a sociological analysis alone. Yeah.
Well, I know, you've done, you had a close relationship with Richard Cabodeau, who was a historian of evangelical Christianity. Durwood Foster was out there at GTU as well, with more a theologian, I think. And right. Anyway, you've had some good teachers. But I know people are eager to hear from you, not me. So I'd like to turn it back over to you and put your questions in the chat column, and I won't talk much at the end. I'll just moderate the questions.
Okay, let's see if I can get more gracefully into my PowerPoint than I did before. Let's see. How's that? Are we back?
Perfect.
Everybody can see it? Okay, great. All right, so oops. We were back. Oh, it's not responding to me. Hold on 1 second, please. Okay. I'm not getting the it's not allowing me to.
We're seeing the presenters mode again, Dr. Mickler.
Okay.
It wouldn't be the end of the world if that's how you had to stay, however, because it does show. I don't.
Yeah, I want to do my, what do you call it? The animation thing. Let's see which one. That's not it.
That looks good. I mean, you're in right screen mode.
Right, but my animations aren't working.
Okay.
Not working here either. Okay, just sorry, just a second. All right, well, so the HSA UWC section extends the history, the story from 54 to 94, and I divided into 4 subsections. The Korea mission, the mission to Japan, the United States, and world mission. And my starting with the Korea mission, This was the focus of activity from 1954 to 1972, when Father and Mother Moon shifted their ministry to the West and relocated to the United States. The key developments during this period were the founding of HSA UWC, which I go into in some detail because it was a major decision to organize separately from Christianity. But following that founding, the church began aggressive outreach on Seoul University campuses, both Ewha and Yonsei. And the target were so-called second generation Christians. So the idea was that the first generation of Christianity was not able to respond to Father Moon's mission and ministry. So the hope was that second generation Christians at Yonsei or Ewha would respond. And sure enough, they did, especially at Ewha Women's University. One of the studies I looked at noted that there were 4,038 students at Ewha Women's University in 1950, in the mid-50s, and somewhere around 400 of them associated with the Unification Church at Ewha in 1955. So that's about a tenth of the student body, which is pretty close to achieving critical mass. And it did spark a reaction. And, you know, I'm sure a lot of you are aware of the history. Father Moon was arrested. He was eventually exonerated and released. During the remainder of the 50s, we see a stabilization of church patterns in the church. And then the Holy Wedding becomes an important dividing line, I think, between the Unification Church Movement as a church and then graduating to being a movement. It was only after the Holy Wedding, when Father and Mother Moon joined together, that Father Moon's family situation was resolved, that the movement element began to develop. And we see during the decade of the 60s, the solidification of the Korean, not just Unification Church, but Unification Church Movement. So key themes during this period were the transition from being an entirely religious organization in the 1950s to a more broadly based movement in the 1960s. And the second theme I would mention would be the emergence of HSA UWC as a missionary faith. And we can track that in Seoul first, then throughout Korea, then to Japan, then to the United States, and then to the world. So I have to talk about the missions to Japan and the United States. First, Japan. We all know that Japan is a HSA UWC success story in many ways. It's a resource engine that has fueled the UCM's global advance. It's manifested what I would call a samurai pattern of absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience, which has brought results, but also sparked intense domestic opposition. The United States, and I'm really summarizing here just some of the key points, was viewed as the UCM's gateway to the world. And in the US in particular, witnessing efforts were supplemented with the development of a formidable organizational infrastructure that expanded the Unification Church Movement to exert influence in all directions, politically, theologically, culturally, and so forth. In terms of world mission, we can track the progression from Japan in 58 to the US in 59, Father Moon's world tour in 65, Father and Mother's world tour in 69. In Europe, 17 nations were pioneered by 1970, and additional nations, I counted 15, Franco Famularo informs me there were more, by 1974, the missionary wave to 95 countries in 1975 with the Japanese, American, and German Trinities, Mission Butterfly in 1980, and following underground to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And then the post-Soviet Union breakup, which led to the largest workshops in Unification Movement history. And not only that, but a transition to a new phase of Unification Church Movement development, which was the Family Federation for World Peace and Unification, which got going in 1994 as the Family Federation for World Peace. Unification added in 1997. I have 3 subsections in going through the Family Fed period. All the peace initiatives that emerged, which was a transition. The last, from 1994, the last years of Father Moon's ministry and the ministry of Mother Moon from 2012. Key developments during this period were increasingly frank public expressions of the Unification Church's movement's messianic premises, a consummate effort to lay the foundations for a unification-styled nation, internal disagreements over whether the Family Fed should identify as a peace movement or as a church, and also over the issue of succession, and the emergence of Mother Moon as a creative and resourceful leader in the mold of her late husband. I see those as 4 key developments. I'm going to look at each one quickly. In terms of the peace initiative, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Unification Church Movement was optimistic about the prospects for world transformation, i.e., to enter the completed Testament age. Family FFWPU was established as a religious but non-sectarian organization for people of all faiths and good conscience. Multiple federations for world peace followed, as did sisterhood ceremonies between representatives from formerly enemy nations, and international marriage blessings were conducted on a mass scale, what was called the globalization of the blessing. In addition, Father Moon proposed renewing the United Nations through a religious assembly, launched a Middle East peace initiative, and called for the creation of an international peace highway connecting the world as a single community. Of course, many of you are well aware of all these developments, but not all the readers of Cambridge University Press are. The last years of Father Moon's ministry was marked by a consummate effort to lay the foundations for Chung-il-guk, or the nation of cosmic peace and harmony. And the Unification Church Movement went into full-scale nation-building mode, registering citizens, conducting coronation ceremonies, promulgating the first articles of the Chung-il-guk Constitution, establishing a Chung-il-guk capital, declaring Jubilee years, the Pacific Rim era, and a new heavenly calendar. At the same time, disagreements over the Family Fed's identity as a peace movement, there were disagreements over the Family Fed's identity as a peace movement or a church. By the time of Father Moon's passing, disagreement had manifested in the leave-taking of his eldest son and lawsuits over Unification Church Movement assets. The ministry of Hak Ja Han Moon, she was faced with major challenges after Father Moon's passing. First of all, there was the passing of Father Moon, who was the unquestioned leader of the Unification Movement for 6 decades. A second challenge was opposition of 2 sons who regarded themselves as Father Moon's rightful successors. And a third problem was a Unification Movement culture that favored male-dominant models of leadership. So these were all major challenges that Mother Moon faced. Her response, she pulled the Unification Movement past the crisis of Father Moon's death. She carved out an independent sphere of charismatic authority withstood criticism, and retained the loyalty of the vast majority of Unification Church Movement membership. And she infused the Unification Movement with fresh energy and developed a distinctive global ministry with new initiatives, such as the Sunghat Peace Prize or the International Association of Parliamentarians for Peace. She undertook major, basically high-risk public rallies at Seoul Olympic Stadium, at Madison Square Garden, and the Rallies of Hope. And she undertook iconic building projects, both in the United States, International Peace Education Center, IPEC, and at Chumpyong Lake as well. So I see that Mother Moon has had a quite, if you just step back and look at her ministry over a decade, it's really quite remarkable, I would argue. Okay, turning to the schismatic organizations, which is the 5th section of this book, I just want to offer a definition of the word schism. It comes from the word to split. So when you mention schisms, you're referring to a group of people who leave a parent body and form a new organization. So that's kind of the definition of schism, a group that leaves a parent body and forms a new organization. I divide the schisms within the UCM into 2 types. One I call splinter groups. These are schisms of relatively short duration and or influence. And the second is schismatic organizations. They actually attain organizational form. They give more evidence of more permanence and impact. And they impact the parent group more substantially. So first, splinter groups. These were charismatically led, mostly short-lived groups animated by claims that one or both of the true parents had failed and or were forerunners to their leader and group. And I identify a few of them. One was the sect of Cleophas Kundiona, popularly known as Black Hunjanim in the 1980s. He led out a small group, led a small sect in Southern Africa. In the 80s, there's the Wu group, emerged in Korea in the 90s. There's a Nakayama group in Japan from the early 2000s. She was a leader who claimed that the unification teachings represented the words of the masculine God, and her group was proclaiming the words of the feminine God. She eventually declared herself a deity in the Philippines. There's the Kamaba group from the 2010s, they called Substantial Word. They kind of derived from the Nakayama group with lacking the flamboyant qualities of the Nakayama group. They're more restrained. And then there's an interesting group called Providence Church or the Christian Gospel Mission. Sometimes it's called Jesus Morning Star. A Mr. Jung had been a member of the Unification Church in the 70s. He broke in the 80s and started his own ministry, which has been pretty successful, but he doesn't acknowledge any links to the Unification Movement, but scholars have noted his history and some of his teachings. He's had a checkered career. He was arrested for rape and spent 10 years in prison. So all of these groups, I term them irritants, but not a threat to the Unification Church Movement. Turning to schismatic organizations, they've been more consequential, and basically there are a couple. First, the Global Peace Festival Foundation or Family Peace Association, led by Hyunjin Moon, father and mother of Moon's eldest son. He refused to give up major Unification Movement assets he controls, and this has led to ongoing litigation for about 11 years. The other is the World Peace and Unification Sanctuary or Sanctuary Church and Rod of Iron Ministries. led by Hyungjin Moon, the former international president of Family Federation and the youngest son of Father and Mother Moon. He refused to discontinue use of the HSA UWC 12-gate symbol at all of his events, including gun-related rallies and gun blessings, which caused confusion. And he went to court to have himself declared the Family Fed leader and did not prevail in that. So they're more consequential, but it's still an asymmetrical conflict. In other words, the organizations led by the brothers possess only a small fraction of the Family Federation's membership. And some have calculated that as being even as low as 4 or 5% of the membership of Family Federation. The vast majority of Unification Church Movement adherents understand Father and Mother Moon to be the embodiments of unification faith, and HSA and FFWPU to be its authoritative institutional expressions. Okay, I'll turn to my conclusions. And here I draw on Frederick Sontag's work from the 1970s. He wrote a book in 1977 titled Sun Myung Moon and the Unification Church. He was a philosopher, a theologian. And he said he came to two firm conclusions after conducting dozens of interviews with UC members and opponents in Europe, the United States, Japan, and Korea, as well as a 6-hour interview with Father Moon. And his two conclusions were, number one, the origins of the movement are genuinely humble, religious, and spiritual. And he put in parentheses, which many doubt. And number two, the adaptability and solidarity of the movement are such that we are dealing with a movement that is here to stay. So these were Sontag's two conclusions. And what I found was that his conclusions are really quite consistent with the historical record as documented in my account, in my historical research. And so just to bear that out a little bit, in terms of the origins question, Father Moon's origins were clearly humble. He was born to a family of rice farmers who sold off most of their holdings during the occupation of Korea by Imperial Japan. He rose above his circumstances, but his religious zeal and life-altering encounter with Christ competed with any aspirations he may have had for a conventional life. The Unification Church Movement's origins were also humble. It was born in a tiny ramshackle sole residence, and it was largely impoverished. The UCM in Japan began with door-to-door collection of cast-off items sold to junk dealers, and the Western Mission funded itself by selling flour and candy. And it's also the case that members followed this pattern as well. They also pursued single-minded religious vocations, exiling themselves from families, careers, and conventional lives. In terms of adaptability and solidarity, adaptability, as I mentioned before, the Unification Church Movement is not a localized phenomenon. It evidenced a capacity to transcend its country of origins and adapt to multiple national settings, absorbing new traits from diverse host societies. And the Unification Church Movement also demonstrated ideological adaptability and adjusting to new circumstances. For example, it shifted from a VOC to a peace movement profile, a victory over communism to a peace movement profile in the post-Cold War era, and from male to female leadership at the apex of its organization following Father Moon's death. In terms of solidarity, despite its broad geographical spread and multinational membership, the Unification Church Movement maintained high levels of internal solidarity. This may be attributed to members' belief in the founder's exemplary character, the clarity of core beliefs, and its identity as a high-demand new religious movement that winnowed out the less committed. And the church movement also facilitated effective bonds through common rituals, notably the marriage blessing, holy days, holy songs, communal worship, and a historiographical tradition that included cherished stories of steadfastness and amid deprivation and suffering. Okay, a final word. These conclusions of Sontag that I agree with, we must acknowledge that they're provisional. The Unification Movement is only 7 decades old, and its development could trend differently. And sociologists of religion, such as Rodney Stark, tell us that new religious movements face crises of confidence as members of the founding generation reach the end of their lives. So the UCM faces a number of challenges. Mother Moon is an octogenarian. She turned 80 years old this year, and leadership provisions will be very important going forward. The Unification Movement needs to hold together its diverse membership base, including those born in the faith. The Unification Church Movement needs to lessen tensions with its host societies, especially in Japan. And the Unification Church Movement will be challenged to maintain its transformative fervor in the face of pressures either to settle down or split apart. So I see those as 4 challenges of the movement, the Unification Church Movement going forward. And that would conclude my presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much again, Dr. Mickler. Excellent presentation, very clear and stimulating, evidenced also by the responses in the chat column, which I'd like to just reference. A number are comments. David Eaton applauds your timing of this brilliant content. Dr. Hendricks points out also kind of agreeing with your point about the larger impact of our movement going beyond Korea, that none rival its scope and impact, and nor the ideological perspective that it puts forward. Jim Edgerly loves your use of the term Unification Church Movement. Dr. Famularo, a colleague who you've worked with in various history of Family Federation projects, asked you to elaborate. I mean, to some extent, he wrote this before you did, but he said about the equally competing splinter or schisms between FFWPU, centered on Mother Moon, and the groups initiated by the Two Sons. If there's anything you want to add to what you've said, somewhat briefly, because we're kind of, I've got about 4 or 5 other questions I'm just going to touch on very briefly that'll also require brief answers.
Right. Well, Franco and I attended the last Cessner conference, which is the premier organization studying new religious movements. And we entered that fray where Family Peace Association has been going regularly for several years and delivering their narrative of what the Unification Church Movement is. And Franco and I turned up this year and challenged that 3 equal faction narrative. And Franco in particular brought in amazing empirical data about membership, the amount of resources and money, and one other empirical element. And it really had an impact on these scholars of new religious movements. And so that battle is not over, but we entered the fray, and I think we gave a good accounting of things.
Well done.
Maybe Alexa Blonner would agree. I see her in the audience, one of our scholars of new religions. I hope she agrees.
Yeah, looks like she's nodding her head.
Okay.
Dr. Ward asks, what role does UTS play in shaping the Unification Church Movement narrative?
Yes, great, great question that we should always be asking ourselves. I mean, I do think that UTS in its formative years, especially under Dr. David S.C. Kim, there was a great deal of theological vigor in the late 70s and early 80s, as you know, Dr. Walsh. And we brought together literally hundreds of professors of religion and theology, and also sociologists of religion, and had an impact and created organizations that eventually evolved into, I would say, the Universal Peace Federation, which you have headed. And so I think as UTS moves into this peace direction, at the inspiration of Mother Moon again, that we can position ourselves to be a leader and be ahead of, try to be ahead of things with our unification movement and make the connections that we need to make going forward.
Very good. Henry Schaufler, he's working with Tom McDivitt on the area of International Media Association for Peace and Times Global Media Network, and he's concerned about, you know, our big programs and what kind of narrative image they project. Particularly, sometimes we see a gap between, let's say, style and an understanding of what makes good impact that may apply in Korea and how that plays in the West. So he's wrestling with that issue, I'm sure, quite a bit.
Yeah, I don't know whether I would have a solution to that. I mean, the big programs, the key is what I think we've been a bit weak on is a lot of the follow-up. And then also in our big programs, continually reaching out to bring in new players that can be part of our work and with whom we can have common cause. So I think we brought in an amazingly oppressive number of people, ranging from the former Secretary General of the United Nations to heads of nations. It's just incredible what the Unification Church Movement has been able to pull together. And I think, you know, Mother Moon has done a good job in focusing on the Korean reunification question as well. As far as in the West, we have a battle with shaping the public narrative in the United States, not just about the unification movement, but the public narrative about so many things.
Right.
And I think all of us need to put our heads together to think about how we can get a handle on that.
Yeah, and tying with Dr. Ward, maybe we could meet with some of our media experts sometime with the UTS, have some kind of roundtable on that topic and discuss it. Frank Lagrateria was intrigued by you pointing out, and I was too, 500 new religious movements emerging in Korea, and he asks, is that unique, or you have any thoughts about why that proliferation in Korea? I mean, I had heard that, there was this explosion of new religious movements in some ways due to the oppression during the colonial era in the first half of the 20th century in Korea. But you may have a better understanding of that.
There were the whole term new religious movement, I believe, originated in Japan in the post-war era, where they were springing up like mushrooms after the Second World War. And a book came out by the title Rush Hour of the Gods, and it was all about these Japanese new religions. And some of them are quite powerful, like what's the one that has the political?
Soga Gakkai and Rishio Kosakai.
Yeah, and Korea is inherently factional, so I can see how they break off. A new one starts, it breaks off into 3 or 4 different factions, and so there's multiplication. I have seen estimates. The low end is 150. I quoted 500. It was the largest one I saw, and that was in an article by Massimo Intravigne, actually. in the Cessner Journal, he co-authored with a Korean authority on new religions, and they claim there were 500 of them since the late 19th century. I mean, you can see charismatic movements all over the world. Like in Africa, you have the African independent churches, and there are literally hundreds of them in sub-Sahara Africa. So, and you can find a lot in the United States as well.
Dr. Shimyo asks a good question again on NRMs in Korea about whether they are more otherworldly in their apocalypticism, meaning that the earth will be destroyed and there will be a spiritual heaven, or if they're this worldly. And if, with your permission, I'm going to read a couple off. You may take a note, that one from Dr. Shimyo, and then Chizoni Ngoma kind of asked, do you think one day we'll have something similar? She mentions the Second Vatican Council to kind of, or you might even think of the Council of Nicaea from the 4th century. What you think about that? Elio Roman talks about the significance of Mother Moon's emphasis on the Chunbo and the tribal Messiah mission. Sebastian Humer, importance of the godly family values for impact on society as a key point of our tradition. I'm sorry I don't have time to give everyone full justice, nor in the responses. Bruce Sucher points out his debate with you over whether we're a church or a movement. I'll leave it at that, but that'll be the final. I'm sorry for those we couldn't cover. But Dr. Mickler, why don't you wrap things up with any brief comments on those questions and any final thought you want to leave us with?
Okay, well, you put quite a bit on the table there. In terms of Dr. Shimyo's question, the otherworldliness, the characteristics that I listed that typify Korean new religions would tend to suggest that many of them are this worldly in their orientation. They look to create ideal cities and things like that. I'm sure there are other worldly ones as well. At the Cessner conference, there was definitely one group, but they tend, if they're otherworldly, they tend to have sort of a conflagration, but then we reconstitute ourselves in this world somehow. Yeah. So I think there is this worldly thrust in Korea. As far as the Vatican Council goes, the councils in the Roman Catholic tradition, there have been 21 of them in the course of the history of Roman Catholic Church, and they are always called when there's a crisis that needs to be worked through. And I could foresee someday that there could be that would be appropriate. I'm not sure that. I guess we could do groundwork at middle levels or lower levels in terms of working with our separated brethren to try to find common elements that could work together. As far as a grand gathering, I don't think that the time is right for that yet. The Chumbo work and the tribal Messiah work, I think that we always have to be strong at the grassroots level. So we may be doing high level witnessing, we may be conducting major events, but if we don't have the presence on the ground and we don't have the living presence there, it's very top heavy, and it's not a healthy or wholesome development for any movement. God's family values is impacting the public, public domain, of course. God's family values, that's kind of a lively discussion, I would say, in the public arena on the family in particular, and it's a real challenge. I think we could be a bit more present in that debate than we are, and hopefully UTS could find a way to do that. And the church movement, the church movement debate, whether we're a church or a movement, you know, in good unification fashion, I would argue let's keep both, and let's keep them in creative tension for the present. Let's organize well, and let's be professional about everything that we do. A lot of our next generation encounter professionals all the time in their lives, except when they encounter us. So I think we should try to uplift our standard at all levels, and we'll be in better stead. So I'd like to conclude just with a motto that that's sort of animated me in my vocation as a unification historian. Early on in my work, I came across a quote by Father Moon that was on the inside cover of an early church magazine called Way of the World. It kind of documented the world mission, and it also had a lot of things to say about things in society. But in the inside cover, I saw a quote from Father Moon, and it read, shoot, I should have written it down. Oh yeah, the work of documentation is just as important as the work of proclamation. Is just as important as the work of propagation. So the work of documentation is just as important as the work of propagation. So that's always sort of animated me in my work. It doesn't mean that if you're documenting what occurred, like the book of Acts or whatever you want to refer to, it doesn't mean you don't, it doesn't mean that it excuses you from propagating. No, you do both. And so that has been one of my mottos in my work as a historian. And the last thing I would say, when Jim Edgerly and I and others studied the early Christianity, and why early Christianity was able to prevail over Rome and the Roman Empire, which would be a good subject for a roundtable someday. One of the key factors that underlay all the other factors in the estimation of Kenneth Scott Latourette, who was a dean of American church historians for the first half of the 20th century, was the ability of Christianity he went through a whole series of 7 or 8 things, but he said the bottom line thing that underlay all of them was the ability of Christianity to cultivate the continuing living presence of the founders in their lives, to cultivate the continuing living presence of the founder. And so Christians were able to continually walk with Jesus, talk with Jesus, experience Jesus in their daily life, at grassroots level, in their families, and so forth. And that was what, more than anything else, made the movement a success. So I think that carries over, I think, to the unification movement as well, to cultivate the continuing living presence of the founders in our lives. So I think I'll just conclude there.
Well, it's an apt point to conclude on. Thank you once again, and congratulations on your book. I hope everybody will pick up a copy, and wonderful evening. I'm in trouble because I went on overtime. I hope, Dean Boyd, you don't scold me too much, but I'd like to thank Dr. Mickler and everybody who turned out tonight and for such a stimulating discussion. I apologize again that we didn't have time for more consideration of every comment and question. Dean Boyd, I'm turning it back over to you, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Walsh, and thank you, Dr. Mickler. Amazing presentation, wonderful presentation. Really, we are proud of having such a wonderful historian in our midst, and also having a good son of our true parents representing the historical perspective. So. And I think this is a good example, Dr. Walsh, of who our faculty is at the seminary, and also the kind of future leaders that we hope to be able to prepare for leadership in our movement. So thank you very much, Dr. Mickler. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight, for being with us, for allowing us this opportunity to share with you. And we really look forward to continuing programming throughout the summer. This will be actually our last Faculty Roundtable program for this semester, as our semester is drawing to the conclusion. We have commencement on the 27th. You will be receiving invitations in your inbox over the summer with other programming, I'm sure, yet to be planned from the seminary. We hope that you enjoy this kind of intervention, that you share it with your friends and neighbors to help them understand more about what UTS is providing for not just our unification community, but for the greater community and at large in the religious world and in society. A recording link for this program will be available on our website, on our homepage. It'll be on the same ad where it says registration. That will change to link. We'll be on the lookout for it for the next few days. And so with that, we'd like to conclude. But before we do, I'd like to ask everybody to go ahead and unmute. If you'd like to agree to Dr. Mickler, no tomatoes, please. Only cheering and happiness. So please go ahead and unmute and say hello to everyone. Then we'll close out.
Dr. Mickler, great presentation. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you, Dr. Mickler.
Nice to
Thank you, Dr. Mickler.
see
Thank
everybody.
you.
everyone. God
Thank you,
bless.
Dr. Mickler.
Thank you.
Nice to
Thank
see
you.
everybody.
Brilliant
Dr. Mickler,
presentation.
super job.
Thank
Great,
you, Dr. Mickler. Job.
great
Good job.
gathering.
Thank
Thank
you
you
very
very
much.
much, brothers and sisters.
Everyone.
Love you all.
Love you all.
God bless.
Thank you for joining us from all over the world. Thank you so much. God bless. Have a wonderful evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are.
Thank
We'll see you
you.
next time.
You.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now. Bye-bye.
Great job.
Bye-bye.